might see me kind of jumping around between the different presentation windows and stuff a little bit more than you would normally, just so that I can try to keep an eye on you guys and on the notes that we're going through at the same time. Okay, there we go. I think that should work for now. Alrighty. So today we are talking about evolution. This idea, this theory that has been developed and tested over the last 150 years or so about where all of the different plants and animals that exist on Earth today come from. And specifically, we're going to be looking at some of the evidence that scientists have uncovered that kind of shows how these different animals and plants are related to each other. So today we're going to talk about evolution and some of the evidence for it. And then on Thursday, we're going to go over these diagrams that are called cladograms, which are essentially big kind of trees showing how different types of animals have evolved from previous types. So that's going to be kind of the Thursday topic. But for tonight, we're talking about evolution. All right, so evolution is this scientific theory that slow change in the structure of plants and animals over time is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. And so obviously the plants and animals that were around during the time of the dinosaurs, and even before that, look a little bit different than the plants and animals that are around today. And evolution is the reason for that difference. So notice that I don't call evolution like a theory, or not, I call it a theory and not like an idea or a guess. And that's because in the scientific world, theory is a very important word. And it means something a little bit different than maybe it does in sort of everyday language. So in science, a theory is a well-supported and testable explanation of phenomena or things that have occurred in the natural world. So one of the key statements here is well-supported. So in order for something to be a theory in science, that means that it has to have a lot of evidence that backs it up. And so evolution is one of those key theories in biology. This idea that slow, gradual change over time produces new organisms that are different from more ancient organisms. So Charles Darwin was a naturalist or a biologist in the mid-1800s. And he is the guy that's credited as initially developing the theory of evolution. He's the guy who kind of initially had the most evidence to support this theory. But it took him about 20 years to gather all the evidence that he needed. So a lot of this evidence came from a voyage during his work on the HMS Beagle. So HMS is like the British system of naming ships. So like how in the US, a lot of Navy ships are called like the USS, I don't know, Kennedy or whatever. In the British naval system, it's HMS. And a ship called the Beagle that essentially left from England and went down around the Caribbean and Galapagos Islands, charting the coastline. And along the way, Darwin spent a lot of the time analyzing all of the different plants and animals that he came across that were different but still looked kind of similar to ones that he was familiar with back in England. So Darwin's initial idea and the main idea of evolution is that there's this common ancestry among species, or this idea that big groups of species today come from some common ancestor, whether that is like groups like whales and dolphins, or groups like the cats, or groups like the beetles and the insects. There's a lot of evidence out there that a lot of seemingly different groups of species, groups of organisms, come from a smaller number of these kind of common ancestors. And so today, we're going to go through a lot of the evidence that scientists have found that supports this idea of evolution, of one ancient species changing and developing into multiple current day species. So the first evidence for the difference between ancient and modern species is this idea of a fossil. So a lot of you are probably familiar with fossils. You've probably seen like pictures of the big skeletons that they have in museums. But fossils can come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. It doesn't have to be bones, although that is probably the most common. A fossil is essentially a hardened, kind of mineralized version of an ancient organism. So whether that's bones, whether that's eggs, so scientists have found fossilized eggs before, they found fossilized poop, they found fossilized footprints, they found impressions of skin that's been fossilized in dirt and clay. So all of these are either impressions or material left behind by ancient organisms that instead of just kind of being degraded and wasting away, instead, through a rather complex process that we're not going to really go into here, they got kind of hardened and mineralized and preserved over millions and millions of years until being discovered by modern day humans. So scientists have found all sorts of different fossils at all sorts of different layers in the Earth's crust. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but usually fossils are found buried in rock, and you can find different types of fossils at different layers. So scientists have found ancient sea life fossils. They found fossils of ancient trees and plants, and they've also found ancient land-dwelling species like the dinosaurs, for example. So how do scientists use fossils in order to tell us not just about how ancient organisms lived, but also about how those ancient organisms through evolution got changed over time into the modern organisms? They do this in a couple different ways. So all of the fossils that have ever been discovered and cataloged are known as the fossil record. So when scientists first started developing and discovering and categorizing fossils, there were kind of two major things that they noticed. They noticed that there were things that existed in the past, so plants and animals that lived in the past, but that don't exist on Earth today. And they also noticed that there are things that exist on Earth today that did not exist in the past. So a lot of the plants and animals that we are currently living with, you're not going to find any fossils of them because they weren't around millions and millions of years ago when these fossils were made. So There are ancient things that aren't around anymore, and there are current things that did not exist millions of years ago that are newer than those ancient things. So the fossil record and what scientists have been able to tell by looking at the rock structures is that the Earth is hundreds of millions of years old. In fact, I think the most recent estimate puts the Earth at somewhere around 4.3 billion years old. So the Earth has been around for a very, 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 very long time. So way before the dinosaurs even, the Earth was still around. One of the early things that scientists noticed when they were looking at fossils is that fossils in the older layers, so in the lower you go in the rock, the older you're getting. And these fossils in these early layers are more primitive than those in the upper layers. So for example, in the lowest, deepest layers of rock, the very first fossils that scientists have found, the oldest ones from somewhere between 500 to 550 million years ago, are these super simple little sea life, almost like early shrimp type creatures. All right. And back 500 million years ago, that was about as big and complex we got in terms of animals on Earth. Were tiny little hard-shelled sea shrimp type creatures. And then in sort of the next layer or so, we get a little bit more advanced. We get some more fish type creatures showing up. So instead of being just these tiny little shrimp, now we've got things that are developing inner bones, they're developing backbones, they're developing muscles. They're still living in the ocean, but they're a little bit more complex than before. Then after that, we get that transition onto land, and we start to get into the age of the dinosaurs. So now we're getting big land creatures as well as big ocean creatures. They're standing on different types of limbs that weren't there before. They're breathing in air, so they had to develop lungs in order to do that. And then after the age of the dinosaurs and the more recent fossils, you get age of mammals. So like sometimes you'll hear stories about like the giant rhinoceros or the woolly mammoths or the huge sloths that walked around that were the size of like a VW bug. Now we're getting more advanced kind of musculature, more advanced and more complex brains and eyes and neural system. So as we go from more ancient to more recent, we also go from more primitive to more complex, more advanced. So scientists also started noticing that these extinct fossils, so these fossils that didn't exactly match anything alive right now, still resembled some modern animals. So like I was saying earlier, a lot of the most primitive early life on Earth kind of resembled shrimp or crabs. Then we get some ancient types of fish species that look a little bit similar to our modern fish. Our dinosaurs look similar to our lizards and our birds that are living today. And then obviously we have the age of mammals. So instead of being reptile-based, now we're mammal-based. Things like carnivores and large herbivores like the rhinos and elephants and stuff like that, that again aren't the exact same as the animals that are alive today, but are still kind of similar. So they look like the current day animals, even if they're not the exact same. So the fact that we're getting more complex as we get older, and animals today resemble the animals and plants from even hundreds of millions of years ago. suggest that there's some sort of common ancestry, that the animals that we have today didn't just appear out of nowhere one day. Instead, they developed by slowly changing the old primitive species into the more current species. So after millions and millions of generations, we end up with these changes, and we end up with kind of new species developing from the more ancient species. So that's where this common ancestry idea comes in. This idea that the species that are on Earth didn't just appear here out of nowhere. They've been developing over the past hundreds of millions of years. Sometimes scientists get lucky and are able to find really clear fossils that show, hey, the more primitive animal looked like this, the more recent animal looks like this. What sorts of animals did we have in the middle? A lot of times you have to get lucky to find these. Again, we don't know everything about all the animals that used to live on Earth millions of years ago. We only know about the animals that we've been lucky enough to find fossils about. And so sometimes you can find these missing links that kind of connect different groups in the fossil record, but you mostly have to be kind of lucky in order to find those exact fossils that you're looking for. So we've talked about how the fossils tend to go, the older fossils are a little bit more primitive, whereas the newer fossils are a little bit more complex, a little bit more advanced. And in general, the way that scientists estimate when certain fossils would have been alive on planet Earth has to do with where those fossils show up in the layers of rock. So you can see here, this is a big canyon that's probably been cut away by passing water over a long period of time. And you can see we have a lot of different rock layers that we can see even with our naked eye due to the different colorations. So you get these colors due to the different minerals that have been deposited there over time. And so the further down you get in the rock, the older that rock layer is. And so the longer ago the fossils would be. So, for example, fossils that you might find closer to the surface could be hundreds of millions of years separated from fossils that are lower down, that are further down in the rock. And so scientists use kind of the rough placement of where they were discovered in these rock layers to determine kind of what time period that the animal or plant existed in. So again, as you go from further down in the rock up to the more topside layer, you're going from more ancient plants and animals up to more recent plants and animals. So if scientists know where in the rock layer that a fossil was found, they can estimate, okay, what time period was this plant or animal most likely living in? So one of the nice things about that is it means that you tend to find different types of fossils in the different rock layers. They're not like all spread out all the way through. So the older you get, again, the more primitive, the more kind of simplistic and smaller the fossils tend to be. And then as you move towards the more recent layer, you get more complicated. So you're never going to find a super complex and recent fossil like buried way, way down in the rock. And then flip side, you're also never going to find a hundreds of millions of year old super primitive fossil kind of right up here at the top. So as you go through the rock layer, you're also going through the different ages of the Earth and the different time periods that these fossils may have been active in. All right, so thanks to these fossils, scientists were able to determine that we're going from more primitive to more complex organisms, and that these primitive, or as we go through the layers, these species resemble some of the species that we have on Earth today, but they're not exactly the same. They're different. So because they're similar, it suggests that they are still related, but because they're not the exact same, it suggests that the new species are kind of the descendants from the more ancient species. So we have sort of like the ancestors that make up the fossils, and then their descendants are the plants and animals that are living with us here on Earth today. All right, so does anybody have any questions so far about the fossils or kind of what they tell us about ancient organisms?
I have a question. So might be a little bit off subject, but um, is it? I mean, is it actually possible for mankind to be able to dig all the way down to like the end of the earth? I mean, to the very, very absolute bottom?
So yes and no. So theoretically we could dig to the bottom of the crust. So the crust is like the rock layer that is sort of the top coating of the earth. It's about 20 miles thick.
Oh,
And so underneath that crust is a huge layer called the mantle, which is basically just made up of lava. So so obviously we all know the earth is round, and then the middle part, so the crust kind of covers the outside, and then the middle part of the earth is all molten rock or lava. And so the crust is like the top covering, like it's sort of like if the earth was an M&M, the lava would be the chocolate and the crust would be like the candy coating on the outside. So comparatively to the rest of the earth, the crust is really thin, but from a human perspective, 28 miles is super deep. Like I think the furthest that anybody has ever dug down in a straight line is like maybe 6 or 7 miles.
yeah.
So yes, we could theoretically in the next like couple hundred years, as technology and digging machinery gets better, we could dig all the way through that 28-mile crust. But we wouldn't really be able to go any further than that because then you're just hitting literal lava and you can't really dig through the lava.
Okay.
All right. Did that kind of help answer your question? All right, cool. All right, so that's sort of the fossil record and what fossils tell us about evolution or how our new plants and animals have descended from the ancient ancestral plants and animals. One other way that scientists have been able to kind of determine how different groups are related to each other and how they've descended from their ancestors over time is through something called comparative anatomy. And Pete, this is where we really start to get into some of the stuff for the assignment that was posted today. So comparative anatomy is just like it sounds like. We're comparing the anatomy or the body parts of different organisms. So by looking at how similar or how different body parts are between different animals or plants, we can find evidence that different groups are more closely related than other groups, and that seemingly distantly related groups have all evolved from the same common ancestor. So the major structure that scientists look for when they're looking for evidence of evolution are what are called homologous structures. So if you remember when we were talking about the genes and the genotypes with the big letters and small letters, homozygous was when we had two of the same letter together. Similarly, here we don't have homozygous, we have homologous structures. And these are structures that are basically the same or have extremely similar structure. So they're set up essentially the same way, but they have some differences in function. So what exactly they do for the animal is a little bit different. So we'll talk about a really good example of this in a second. But these homologous structures are evidence of a common ancestor. So they suggest that at one point, millions of years ago, there was one species that had this certain structure. And then over time, as thousands and millions of generations go by, that's one structure gets tweaked and shifted and changed little bit by little bit by little bit. And the different descendants, the different new species that have evolved. And now we have the same basic structure still there, but it's been modified to do different things in different plants or animals. So an extremely great example of homology or homologous structures are the arm or leg bones of land animals, or I should just say mammals in general. So if you'll notice on these structures, we have humans, we have a shrew, which is kind of like a mouse type creature. We have dogs and sheep. We have some sea mammals like dolphins and seals. And we have some flying animals like birds and bats, and even an ancient dinosaur, a pterodactyl. So these different animals use their structures in a little bit different ways, use their arms in different ways. So humans and shrews use theirs to grasp and hold on to things. Dogs and sheep are more developed for running. Dolphins and seals obviously use their flippers for swimming. And then birds and bats and even pterodactyls are flying animals. They use theirs for flight. So all of these are a little bit different functions, but look at the structure of each one of these arms. You'll notice in the human, we have our bones labeled out here. So there's a lot of different names for these bones. I want you to focus on this basic structure though. So in a human, up here would be like the shoulder. So between the shoulder and the elbow, we've got one bone. Between the elbow and the wrist, we have two bones, the ulna and the radius. And then in the wrist and hand, we have lots of little bones, the metacarpals, carpals, and phalanges out through here. So one bone, two bones, lots of little bones. So that's what makes up the human arm. What about a shrew arm? Shrews have one bone, two bones, lots of little bones. Okay, but humans and shrews use their arm for kind of similar things. What about dogs and sheep? Well, dogs have one bone, two bones, lots of little bones. Sheep have one bone, two bones, lots of little bones, and then their wrist and finger bones have actually been fused. So the wrist bone have been fused into one big bone. You'll see this a lot in animals that have hooves, have been fused, and then their fingers have been turned into hoofs, but it's still the same overall structure. Same thing with the flippers of dolphins and seals. We have one bone, two bones, lots of little bones, one bone, two bones, lots of little bones. And then even in structures as diverse as wings, which you might think are completely different from arms, look at a bat wing, we've got one bone, two bones, lots of little bones. Same thing with the bird wing. You have one bone, two bones, and then some little bones in here. And even going all the way back to dinosaur times with the pterodactyls, they also had one bone, two bones, and lots of little bones. So again, a little bit more blurry, but zoomed up view. We still have the same general groups: grasping, walking, swimming, and flight. They all have the same structure, right? One bone, two bones, lots of little bones. So they use their structures for slightly different things, but all their structures are made up of the same general features. One bone, two bone, lots of little bones. This is what we mean when we talk about structures that are similar in structure but different in function. So all of those arm and leg bones from all those different animals have the same underlying structure, the same type of bone structure, but they've evolved and differentiated over time to do different things, whether that's help with swimming or flying or running or grasping. So what all of these different structures suggest is that at some point, millions and millions and millions of years ago, when arm bones were first starting to develop in some of the first creatures that were making that transition from the water to the land, right? So fish, for the most part, their fins don't really have any bones in them. They're just kind of like these thin membranes that they're able to float about with. But when you start to get onto land, you need something that's going to help push you around. And so some of the first organisms that developed bones in their arms, or what would become their arms, developed this general pattern of one bone, two bones, smaller bones. So that general structure evolved to help those early organisms walk around on land. And then over the next hundreds of millions of years, those structures got modified and specialized for running or grasping or swimming or flying or whatever they might be used for, but they kept that same basic structure under the hood, right? It's kind of like the same idea as cars. So cars today use the same basic mechanics under the hood as the very early like Model A's and Model T's did back when Henry Ford was cranking them out, right? It's still the same idea as some fuel goes in, it gets ignited, it pushes a piston, which turns a crankshaft, and then that process repeats. But they've just modified it and enhanced it and changed it to be more fuel efficient, produce more power, so on and so forth. But it all came from the same general structure, the same initial underlying structure. So that's what we mean when we talk about how these homologies, these homologous structures, provide evidence that there was some common ancestor at some point that had the one bone, two bone, little bones structure, and then that just grew and diversified across the animal world, at least in terms of animals that had arms with bones in them. All right, so I know that was kind of a lot of information to throw at you guys right there. Does anybody have any questions so far about these homologous structures or how they suggest this idea of a common ancestor? Anything that you want me to go back and hit on again?
No, I'm good.
No.
All right, thanks, Roberto. Thanks, Yusha.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have these homologous structures, of which arm bones are one of the best examples, that suggest that all of these different organisms at one point, millions and millions of years ago, descended from the same common ancestor. So those are homologous structures. On the flip side of that, there are also structures called analogous structures. So these guys are structures that in different organisms are used for the same thing. So they have similar functions, but they do not have the same structure. So they are not an example of common ancestry, right? They do not have the same general structure underneath the hood. They're totally different, even though they're used for the same thing. So an excellent example of analogous structures would be things like the wings of a bat and the wings of a fly or some other insect. So bats, like we were just looking at, have that one bone, two bone, little bone structure. Only in this case, their little bones and their fingers are what make up their wings, essentially. Insects do not have, well, they don't have any bones at all, but their wings are made out of this really thin kind of membrane material. And they're only attached to their body up here in kind of the middle of their body section. So they don't have any sorts of bones or any sort of structure running through the wing itself. So its structure is completely different from the bat wing, right? They're created in totally different ways by the bat body versus by the fly body. But they use both of them for flying. So they do the same function, but they're structured completely differently. So this suggests that bats and flies did not have some sort of flying common ancestor that they split off from, right? Obviously, bats are mammals, flies are insects, they're completely different animal groups. And so bats and flies evolved the ability to fly separately, right? They didn't have some sort of common ancestor that could fly and then changed over time into bats and flies. So analogous structures show us ways that different groups have evolved the kind of same traits or the same abilities in completely different ways. Same thing also with insects and birds. So birds have a bone structure extremely similar to bats. They are vertebrates, so they still have the one bone, two bone, lots of little bone structure. Their wing looks a little bit different, but it's the same general set of bones. Again, insects like this damselfly right here, absolutely no bones in their entire body, but especially in their wings. They don't have feathers. They have, like the bird, they have this really thin membrane material. And so these are analogous structures. They do the same thing, but they evolved completely separately from one another. Again, birds and damselflies do not have a common ancestor that could fly, that then one branch developed the birds and one branch developed the flies. That is not what happened here. Instead, we just evolved flight through two different sets of structures, two different ways. So, homologous structures are the same basic structures that do slightly different things in the animals that they're in. Analogous structures are two structures that do kind of similar things in different animals, but developed completely differently, are different from each other in terms of their overall structure. So homology does show this common ancestor that had sort of the base structure that got changed over time. Analogy does not show a common ancestor. It shows that these guys had completely different ancestors that developed these similar abilities, these similar functions, in different ways. So they came up with different solutions to the same problem, essentially. So we can also look at this even in a little bit kind of closer related species. So seals and penguins are both vertebrates, right? They both have bones and they both have a backbone. Seals, however, are mammals and penguins are birds. So you notice that seals and penguins both have sort of similarly shaped bodies. They have these really kind of circular, long body shapes to help them swim through the water, right? They're both water-dwelling species for the most part. So just because they have similar body shapes does not mean that seals and penguins had some sort of similar ancestor that had this long oval body that then branched off and one group became seals and one group became penguins, right? Obviously, we know that's not true. Seals developed from mammals. It's from an ancestral mammal species. And penguins are birds, so they developed from an ancestral bird species. So even though they have similar body kind of functions, even though they both have these big, long, oval, streamlined bodies, they didn't develop that from a common ancestor. They developed it because they both live in the water, and animals that live most of their life in the water tend to want to be able to swim around in the water pretty easily and efficiently. And the best way to do that is to have a long body that's sort of this oval shape so the water can pass by, can be more streamlined through it. So they got to having similar body shapes even though they did not have a recent common ancestor. All right, so one last piece of anatomy that we're going to talk about are some structures that aren't really used by a species that can give clues to sort of the evolutionary history of that species. So these guys are called vestigial structures, and they essentially are remnants of organs or structures that had some sort of important function in an earlier ancestor, but now aren't really used by the current species. So, for example, ostriches are birds. Because they're birds, they have wings. However, ostriches do not use their wings. Ostriches live on the ground. They are too big to fly. And yet, even though they don't use them, they still grow and develop wings. And that's because ostriches had a recent common ancestor with other bird species that was a bird and had wings. And so even though ostriches over time developed the ability to stay on the ground and live on the ground, they never lost their wings. They still developed their wings like any other bird would. Some good human examples include the appendix, which most people know about if it gets inflamed and bursts and you have to go to the hospital and get it taken out. The annoying thing about this is that the appendix doesn't really do a whole lot for our human body. There are some studies that suggest that maybe it might like slightly boost your immune system by a little bit when you're younger, But for the most part, the appendix is basically useless, and you do not need it inside your body in order to function at 100% efficiency. But why do we still have it? It's because earlier human ancestors, it was more useful and it played more of a role in their body. But as humans developed over time, we have other systems get developed that help us do what the appendix used to do. So now we don't need it anymore. Same thing with your coccyx. So your tailbone, like if you feel all the way down to the back of your spine, basically right above the crack of your butt is a coccyx, a tailbone. It's a short little bone that comes down from the bottom of your spine. And it's there because the ancestors of humans had tails. So humans are descended from ancient organisms that had tails, like many mammals do. Humans do not have tails, but we still have that little tailbone that's a leftover of when we used to have to develop a full tail. Over time, as we became more upright and more bipedal, walking around on our two legs, we didn't need the tail anymore, so it gradually kind of became shorter and shorter and shorter until eventually we stopped developing it. But we still have not fully lost that sort of baseline pattern for us that says you got to start making the bones for a tail. Same thing with organisms that are missing their legs, such as a whale or a snake. Hold on. Here we go. So all land-based vertebrates, so whether or not you're an amphibian, a reptile, a bird, or a mammal, the most ancient common ancestor of four-limbed vertebrates, land-based vertebrates, had four limbs. So all the other things, land-based vertebrates that survive on Earth today, are based from this four-limbed ancestor. So most organisms, most vertebrates still have those four limbs, either if it's four legs, like in most mammals and reptiles and amphibians, or if it's two arms and two legs, like in humans, or if it's two legs and two wings, like in birds, we still have the four appendages. Most ocean-based mammals, like whales and dolphins, lost their legs when they transitioned from living on land back to living in the ocean. But they still have these small bones right around where their pelvis used to be, even though they don't have a pelvis anymore. They don't have any legs. Same thing with snakes, like this boa constrictor skeleton here. They also, close to the rear part of their body, have these small little vestigial bones that developed because they had an ancestor that had four limbs. And so even though they've lost those limbs and they've lost the ability to use any limbs back here, they still have these vestigial structures that are sort of evolutionary leftovers from when in the ancient past they used to be four-limbed organisms. So it suggests that salamanders and whales and snakes, especially the whales and snakes, even though they don't have four limbs anymore, they used to have four limbs way in the ancient past, and that helps connect them to all of the other vertebrate species that also have four limbs. So sometimes you can kind of see it in certain species of snake, like pythons, in certain areas down close to the end of their tail. They have these little openings where they have these tiny little femurs, these little leg bones that can protrude if you kind of push down on them to make them exposed. Again, these are those vestigial structures that are basically left over from the era millions of years ago when the ancestor of snakes did used to have four limbs that they walked around on. So even though the snakes lost limbs, they kept some of these leftover pieces behind. So here is the man himself. This is Charles Darwin, the scientist who in the late 1800s first came up with this theory of evolution. This theory that all of the current day plants and animals that exist on Earth are related to each other and are descended from more ancient and more primitive species from millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions of years ago. And in the 150 so years since Darwin published his theories, scientists have found all this evidence from looking at fossils and seeing the similarities between fossil animals and animals alive today, and how the fossil record shows us going from more primitive species hundreds and hundreds of millions of years ago, developing into more complex species as they've evolved over time. They've also found those homologies, those shared structures between different groups of organisms that point to them having some sort of common ancestor that they then descended from. So there used to be some sort of common ancestor that had a 1 bone, 2 bone, lots of little bone limb, and then all of their descendants had that same structure for limbs, even though it may have been modified to do something different. All higher vertebrates that come from land animals started off with having 4 limbs. And so now, even if they don't have those 4 limbs still, they still have those vestigial structures, those leftovers in their bodies that are evidence that they come from ancestors that used to have 4 limbs, but that they have lost those over the period of evolutionary time. So all of the evidence that scientists have discovered since Darwin's time have only gone to further support his initial ideas about how species have evolved and descended and modified over time. Right. So does anybody have any questions about fossils or homologous structures or anything related to evolution that I've talked about so far tonight?
No, sir.
All right. Thanks to Berto. Anybody else? Anything that you want me to go back over? Alrighty. So the assignments, the homework assignments for today and tomorrow focus a lot on those structures that we were talking about at the end of the notes today, both the homologous structures and those analogous and vestigial structures. And so the assignment that got posted today has that same structure of comparing a human bone in this first picture to a whale bone, a crocodile bone, arm, I should say, they have lots of bones, whale arm, crocodile arm, cat arm, bird wing, and bat wing. And so what you're going to do is for the cat arm and for the crocodile arm, I want you to tell me 2 things about it. I want you to tell me, how is it different from the human arm in terms of its form? So how are the bones in a cat arm and how are the bones in a crocodile arm structured differently from the bones in a human arm? Are they longer? Are they shorter? Are they thicker? Are they skinnier? Etc. And then also, how do cats and crocodiles differ from humans when it comes to using their appendages. So I have some examples here comparing the whale arm to the human arm. And actually, I brought up the Google Form version, but the Google Doc version does a little bit better job of actually kind of showing everything together. Because in the Google Doc version, I can make it into this nice little table here. So for example, if we look at the whale arm right here compared to the human arm, you can see that the whale arm has much shorter and thicker bones, and then the metacarpals, kind of the middle bones, and the finger bones are much longer. And then the thumb has been like shortened to a stub. Not really much of a thumb bone in the whale. So like you can see right here, this is the whale's thumb. Pretty much a short little stub. So that's comparing it to the human arm in terms of the form, how it's actually structured. And then the second thing is you'll compare it to the human arm in terms of its function. So obviously, whales don't really need a long like wrist or arm, but they need a wide fin in order to help them move through the water, which is where those long finger bones come in. And then it doesn't really need a thumb because whales aren't doing a whole lot of grabbing onto stuff, which is what we usually use our thumb for. So you're going to do similar things with the cat and the crocodile arms. So you're going to compare how are these different to the human arm in terms of its form or its structure. How are the cat and crocodile bones structured differently, human bones? And then you're going to write a little bit about how they use them differently than humans. So how do cats use their legs differently than we use our arms? How do crocodiles use their legs differently than we use our arms? So again, going back to that idea of comparing the overall the similar structure, but looking at how the small differences in structure relate to the different types of uses that the animal gets. And then the assignment that'll be going up for tomorrow has a couple different parts. The first part is about looking at this butterfly's wing versus a bird's wing and asking about what do these animals use these wings for? How are they different from each other in their form or their structure? And then what makes them good analogous structure examples, which we talked about earlier in class tonight. And then the second part asks about comparing this cave fish over here with this more traditional minnow on the right, and asking what is the biggest difference between a cave fish and a minnow that you can see just by looking at a picture of them. And then why is it that if they both came from some sort of common ancestor, the cave fish has evolved without the ability to see? So cave fish lack eyesight. And why might that be the case if they're descended from fish that are able to see? All right, so that is your Tuesday and Wednesday assignments coming up over the next couple days. All right, let's see, where's the, there we go. All righty, So did anybody have any final question about evolution, fossils, structures, or the homework assignments?
No. No.
All righty, guys. Well, if you ever do have questions about anything, please feel free to reach out to me either send me a text, send me an email, leave a comment on the Google Classroom like, hey, I know we went over this, but I'm still kind of confused. I still don't really get this part. And I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I am able and hopefully help you out with whatever you're stuck with. But that will just about do it for biology class this evening. Thank you guys so much for being here and for sitting through all that with me. I know it's a lot, and I wish we had more time to get into the evolution stuff because it's really cool. I think you guys would dig it. But we're getting close to the end of the semester, so we got to go. But you guys have a good rest of your evening and a good Wednesday, and I will see you back here for our next class on Thursday night.
All right, thank you.
No problem. Bye, guys. See you on Thursday.